So this video is going to do three things. Number one, it's going to serve as an update on my resting squat mobility as to where I'm at now, some 6, 7 or maybe even 8 months since the 30-30 squat challenge. It is going to help you at number two, if you have done the 30-30 squat challenge but you're worried about losing the range of motion you may have gained. We are going to cover ways to maintain that, so do not fear anymore. And number three, if you're someone who hasn't got the time to put into the 30-30 squat challenge but still wants to improve their resting squat, this video is going to be for you, because we are going to break down all the components involved in maintaining and improving your resting squat. So let's go over 5 things that you can work on to improve your squat without actually sitting in a resting squat, starting with the most important one in first place. So this is the Tibialis Raise. This is a heaven-sent exercise, seemingly almost worthless. Nobody trains their tibialis. I was in fitness and have kind of like a near 9-year training career, and I hadn't done my first Tibialis Raise till like the end of 2021. So that just shows you how much these fly under the radar. But this is actually a crucial muscle for pulling the toes up above the heel. And when in daily life do we ever have the toes above the heel? Let's face it, we always have the heel above the toe, whether that's due to, using shoes with heels on, or even just sitting. There's just hardly any point in which you are pulling your toes above your heel, and yet we expect our ankles to maintain enough mobility to really get our knees over our toes. Doesn't really make much sense to me. But the Tibialis Raise is the perfect remedy because it brings up the strength in the tibialis. And if you actually train the Tibialis Raise at a volume higher than you do with your calf raises, so even if you train your calves or not, they can still be tight, and you don't have to have big developed calves to have tight calves. Even people with the most string bean pipe cleaner calves can still have tight ankles, as I'm sure you've experienced and seen. So what I've done here, or what I've started to experiment with over the last 6 months, is playing with a 2-to-1 ratio of tibialis work to calf work. So I still train the calves exactly as I normally would, only I double up with Tibialis Raise volume. And the Tibialis Raise is one of those exercises you can train it anywhere. You pretty much just need a wall. Okay, you can do the bench version, but I don't think that's that necessary. The only real benefit of the bench version is that it's a little bit more concentrated. There isn't so much need for stability, and you can actually micro-load it. But really, if you do the back to wall version, keep your knees locked and track the distance from your heels to the wall, that in itself is still a form of sort of tracking progress, and you just move your feet forward, and you can even modify the rep ranges. So as I said, doing this for more volume than you do calf work will be a massive, massive boost to your squat game. And I honestly think that's probably one of the key reasons why my resting squat is still decent, and my pistol squats are back to where they used to be back in the glory days. And I've kind of bypassed all that ankle tightness now and springboarded forward to more new levels of comfort, right down in the hole, as it were. And number 2 is our stupidly simple one of the 5, and this is the use it or lose it kind of principle. But in our case here, we are just going to visit the position little and often. Now, this doesn't need to be a huge amount. This can literally be as simple as every time you train, regardless of what you train, you just throw a squat based pattern, or you get into a squat in your warm-up. One of my favorite drills that I featured on this channel back in the day is the squat to fold combination. I will do that pretty much in every warm-up, whether I'm teaching classes, whether I'm training myself, whether I'm working one-on-one with someone. That is a movement that will feature pretty regularly, because I think it's just a lovely combination, and it gives you some time to go in and out of a nice deep resting squat dynamically. That isn't the only way you could do it. If you were squatting sort of pre-leg day, I'm not saying that you do your big heavy sets right down to that depth, but why don't you do your warm-up sets to that depth? Why don't you do a few cool-down sets to that depth, just as a kind of mobility, kind of retaining approach? Of course, another option is doing it kind of grease the groove style, but without being super official with it. Literally, if you're working at desk or you're sitting down for a little while, just stand up once every half an hour, drop down into a squat. It can be as little as 10 seconds to 30 seconds. If you're squatting well with all the good form cues, trying to push tall, feeling the stretch in your ankles, pulling the toes up, really trying to get your posture right and the position right, that's probably all you need. When that multiplies over the course of a day and over the course of the weeks, your body is going to see no reason to forget that position. It's going to see that position as crucial. So therefore, it's going to be in your repertoire in terms of mobility positions that you can access. In at number 3 or 3rd on the list is hip flexor strength. Now, usually when people hear this, they're like, hip flexor strength? That means you're going to tighten up the hip flexors? That means I'm going to be tighter and shorter? I actually need more hip mobility, not less? Yeah, well, this is where it gets interesting. Just because your hips are tight doesn't mean that they're strong. Oftentimes they are tight and weak. And yep, the hip flexor strength in the end range is actually something that's lacking in a lot of people. There are a couple of ways we can train this and even test this. Put your back against the wall, stand back to wall, lift one knee up without your hands as high as you can and just hold it there for 30 seconds. While you do that hold, I want you to maintain a wry smile on your face to show us that you're enjoying yourself. And yeah, let me know how easy that is. Of course, the reality for most of you people will that the leg will start gradually dropping and the fight to keep the knee up will start getting worse and worse, and you'll look like you're having some sort of epileptic fit towards the end of the set. This is normal, but this is an indication that your hip flexors aren't used to lifting the legs up, so therefore your nervous system doesn't recognize that deep range in its hip flexors as normal, which is another reason why you'll find deep squatting harder, just because your hips just aren't used to that position, which is a result of weakness. There's a couple of ways you can strengthen the hip flexors. The bent leg way is probably the best way to make it more specific to squats, but it can also be done straight leg. As a brief side note, I did a lot of straight leg hip flexor work in my front splits journey, things like active heel lift offs, overcoming isometrics, and lifting my leg to a target and holding it there. This stuff's brutal, but I'm super glad I did it back then and kind of pushed through it, because it's meant that my hip flexor strength nowadays is quite up to par. It's maybe not as strong as some, but it's certainly kind of, I would say, in the top maybe 90% easily of people when it comes to the average population. But the bent leg version will be more specific to you. A nice way to do this, and I've got to give credit to the genius that is Ryan Farnley of his channel Viper. So go check that out if you haven't already, if you really like kind of like, you know, obscure training methods that really work. He is your man. The guy is a genius. He has the drill where you hold the knee at your chest with your hands. This is a passive hip flexion. Take the hands off and you fight to maintain the lift of the knee. This is a great way to pattern the nervous system into trying to contract and hold the leg into those deeper ranges. And this will be really, really beneficial to your squat depth, especially when done consistently over time. On to number 4 now, and this one will seem a little counterintuitive at first glance, but bear with me, and that is training the calves. But we're not just training the calves, we are training the calves properly. And by properly, I mean through a full range of motion. How often do you see anybody doing calf raises for a truly full range of motion? I mean, let's face it, where's the stretch? Most people are just bouncing in and out of the mid-range, barely even getting into full plantar flexion, let alone full dorsiflexion. And even if they do touch on full dorsiflexion, they're certainly not spending a long time in full dorsiflexion. This is a big mistake, in my opinion, because this will enable you to not only train your calves kind of guilt-free, if we can term it that, but it'll also mean that you'll maintain better range at your ankles. And of course, like we've just been saying, you'll be stronger because you're used to contracting from a stretched position, and the muscles will be stronger in a longer range. And if we've established anything so far on this channel, it is that strength through length rules and reigns supreme when it comes to mobility development. So the practical calf training applications here are simple. 1, we want to train the calves with our foot elevated, which will enable us to get a stretch at the bottom. And when we go for the stretch at the bottom, we want to be able to hold it for at least 3 seconds, sometimes up to 5 seconds, maybe even as high as 10 seconds. There are so many old school strength coaches that used to endorse this as a plateau buster for people whose calves wouldn't grow. Their theory being that there was no room for the calf muscle to actually grow because the fascia was just so tight from not being stretched. Obviously, if you go for longer holds at the bottom, this is going to be better for mobility, maybe not so good for sheer strength. So you will have to pick and choose which one suits you. But the golden rule is no less than 3 seconds at the bottom, where you're really trying to keep the legs straight, drop the heel down as far as possible, maybe even try to pull the big toe up towards the kneecap. All of this in unison will give you a lovely, lovely stretch at the bottom. And it will also give the calf some strength through length, which will apply and carry over to your resting squat position really nicely. And a real quick side note on that, a little tip that I can give you from my own experience is try to train the weak side or the weak ankle. And let's face it, we've all got one that's tighter than the other, with slightly more volume than the good side. That's what I did. So I trained my calves single leg and still do. And I would do 4 sets on my weaker leg and only 3 sets on my stronger leg. Rep range and weight the same, tempo the same, but I would just let each week add up, where that extra set would add up in terms of total volume. And over time, that has made my left ankle not only feel stronger, but also a little bit more mobile relative to the right. Now, of course, yet another disclaimer, you're never going to feel completely symmetrical. There's always going to be one you favor more than the other. But if it's a glaring imbalance, that's something that needs to be addressed, as that will definitely limit the depth of your resting squat. And our fifth and final component to a perfect resting squat will be the hip flexor length. Now, this isn't what you think it is. I know some of you are thinking, finally, he's addressed something that involves hip mobility and hip stretching. Yeah, I have. But again, if you've been paying attention so far, we are going to go down the strength through length route. I'm sure you've all stretched your hip flexors passively. Yes, it feels nice. Yes, it clears tension. But does it last? No, it doesn't. The only way we get it to last is, as we keep saying, is to get strong in those end ranges. How do we do that? Well, we need to strengthen the glutes and hamstrings in a specific joint angle that puts the hip flexor under stretch. There are a few ways we can do this. One of my favorite ways to do this, that's really simple, is the lunge heel drive. So you get into a lunge stretch, just a passive yoga-based lunge, and then you pull the heel towards the bum as far and as hard as you can without letting the hip position change. You can hold this statically for time. You can do it for reps. You can push against an object like a block. There are so many ways you can do this. And this drill really targets the shortening side of the joint. As I just said, the hip extensors, the glutes and hamstrings. Another nice exercise is the front foot elevated split squat. Now, this really does kill two birds with one stone because you are stretching the front ankle in a very specific, if not exact, joint angle and knee angle that you would require in a deep resting squat, whilst also lengthening the back leg out under load. So again, strength through length with many functional benefits. Again, that's a knees over toes guy staple. You can start up as high as you need and as light as you need. And the more advanced you get, you just bring the front foot down, still trying to get that fully closed front knee. This will take some time and an incredible level of ankle mobility, but the general rule of thumb is the back leg is trying to be pulled back as straight as possible while the front knee bends as much as possible. If you get really strong here, there is no way you won't be able to squat deep. There's also no way you won't be able to have front splits cold and all the other cool stuff that will become accessible and available as a byproduct of getting good at the mighty front foot elevated split squat, which I think before the knees over toes guys system was very much underrated and underused. It was all about the Bulgarian or rear foot elevated split squat, whereas I think nowadays people are starting to show more love to the front foot elevated split squat, and for good reason. There you go, guys. 5 tips to improve your resting squat or maintain what you currently have. Which one of those helped you the most? Feel free to leave me a comment down below. I'd love to know which one you found most useful. Thanks for watching the video as always. If you like the video, give me a nice little thumbs up just to support the channel. Subscribe if you like this kind of content. Plenty more where that came from. Have a great week, and I'll catch up with you all in the next video. Peace out.